Okay, this is Chapter 3, Part 1. In this chapter, we're going to go over various legal philosophies with a little more detail and depth than what we introduced in the last chapter, talking about these very broad perspectives of idealists versus pragmatists. There are diverse views about the role of law in society. There are multiple competing philosophies. So like so much when you're dealing with people, with human issues, and here we're talking about the law, people have various competing approaches and don't really agree what the best way is to approach the law. So what we want to do in this chapter is not so much judge the good versus the bad, but just to go over the basic ideas from major perspectives so you can understand the range of philosophies that people have in understanding the law. How satisfied people are with the current state of the criminal justice system depends on their legal philosophy. And that's one of the reasons really in this course why we focus on these philosophies is you might think, well, they're not very practical. They're so removed from everyday life or removed from working as a criminal justice professional that they don't seem very relevant. But actually, if you look at it carefully, you can see that how you come down on a lot of these issues, how you think the criminal justice system should be run, and what laws and policies we have depends a lot on your philosophy. And so the practical aspect of this is for you folks to decide for yourselves the approaches that you think make sense, so that you can have a clear understanding of how you come down on these things and you know where you're coming from. So a lot of it is sort of figuring these things out for yourself, which I'm not going to tell you which way to go on these and how to come down on these. That's really up to you. I'm just here to help you see the full menu of possibilities, and you order what you want. Now, they get into principles versus rules. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this section. Rules are externally imposed guidelines that shape our behavior. So laws and policies would be example of rules. Rules provide order and consistency, but can be seen as illegitimate if they seem unreasonable. So the rules versus principles. Rules are specific. The things that we tend to follow in a concrete way if we're working as some employee within the criminal justice system. There's always lots of policies, lots of rules. A lot of this comes from laws that have been laid down. That's as opposed to principles, which are the reasons behind the rules. So the principles are the big perspective, right? Core values that lead us to come down in specific ways on policies, on rules, on laws. These principles generally express broad ideas and values about how the world ought to work. An example that we'll talk about in this chapter and in subsequent chapters is that you might have a core value of we want to have laws that minimize the harm to people. What we're after is harm minimization. And that's what we want to focus on and sort of center our policies on, is trying to reduce harm. That's just one way to think about it. There are others we'll talk about. Principles can work as a heuristic. That's a term you should know. And a heuristic is just like a model or a decision-making aid, a framework from which you can get guidance about how to come down on these issues. So a heuristic to develop, evaluate, or to clarify. So you can think of these various philosophies, legal approaches, as being heuristics, which kind of help guide you in deciding what policies and laws that we should have pertaining to crime in the criminal justice system. Many criminal justice debates concern which principle should prevail or how best to apply a principle. And I think a lot of principles we agree with in very abstract, broad terms, like we all believe in justice, we believe in fairness, we believe in equality, we believe in democracy, but sometimes people will prioritize some of those more than others. And how you come down concretely on different issues can be very different, even though everybody agrees that these values are important. How you interpret those can differ from person to person. And so a lot of these debates are over the details, or not that we differ that much in the basics, but which basics we give priority to and how we spell those out in actual real life. Now, this next one, I want you to get this. An important distinction is in law is between public and private morality. Make sure you understand those. What we mean by those is legal experts like to divide issues up into whether they're really public issues or private issues. So if you, if I recall, the textbook might even use these examples that people might consider the issues of gun control to be public issues of public law, public policy, public morality, because sometimes, occasionally, guns get misused and that they harm other people. And so, since in the United States we know we have a murder problem, you have, say, 15,000 people murdered per year in the United States. It's a serious social problem that we have. Most of those are committed with guns. And so guns are often considered to be sort of issues that are relevant to public debate, because they affect various people, not just individuals who might own those legally, but they involve and implicate other people as well. And there's, you can think of public morality as being issues of right and wrong that seem to pertain to, that affect people generally through society in a public sort of way. Things that happen in public where a lot of people congregate, and the idea is that you should be able to have more rules, regulations over those public spaces compared to, say, your home. And a lot of times the private morality, the focus is on your own home. And the idea is that, well, if you're in your own house and you're not bothering anybody else, well, then the issues of right and wrong, that's sort of private morality, and we really don't want to get into that too much. So if you like to use drugs in your own house, but you use them in your house and you're not out in public getting high or bothering people or maybe behaving erratically or something in a public setting, but instead you're getting intoxicated, getting high at home, well, that's your own business, because that's private morality. That doesn't really affect me as long as you're doing this thing at home. And so maybe we shouldn't have laws and policies regulating what goes on within the four walls of your house. So anyway, this distinction gets made between public morality and private morality. You don't have to necessarily agree with that. You could say, well, morality is morality, and we need to look at that on a case-by-case basis, and there are certain things that could happen within the four walls of a home that we're concerned with, and maybe you want to pass laws about, like, say, for example, domestic family violence or child abuse or something. So this is an example of a heuristic, of a sort of a model that we use to a typology here, in this case, of public versus private morality, and how it can be a useful tool to help us analyze things. That's what they mean by heuristic. Let's see here. Okay, now, I don't think I want to go over all of these. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, where they talk about 6 concepts that help us to understand the role that law plays in society. I'm going to skip this part, but we'll bring it up again when we go over 2 competing perspectives, with a couple of kind of a famous debate that the textbook talks about. So again, take a look at these on your own, but in the interest of saving time, I won't go through each of these 6 concepts. Now, this debate I do want to talk about, I do think it's important, between 2 legal scholars, Hart and Devlin. So this debate, their first and last names, H.L.A. Hart and Patrick Devlin, had a big, and these were English legal scholars, but we've been, just so you know, we've been influenced, our legal system has been influenced a great deal from the British. We basically inherited the English traditions of law And so that's still with us today, even in 2020. We're still influenced a lot by English traditions of law. So this is a debate that's definitely relevant for American society, even though these are British scholars arguing about British issues. So they had this famous debate where they were disagreeing over the role of morality in law. Let's get into the specifics of that. So Hart was a pragmatist. We've already talked about pragmatism. Devlin was an idealist. So that helps divide in where the perspectives that these two are coming from. A report was issued by the British government, and this is back in the 1960s, so it's been a while, but still this is a kind of a classic, famous example of debates over the law. This report was called the Wolfenden Report, and they looked carefully at issues that were considered to be, by the people studying this, that were considered to be more private morality issues. Should prostitution be legalized? Should homosexuality be legalized? At the time, it was illegal in Great Britain. But this report analyzed these two issues, which again were kind of thought to be, well, maybe these are private things that happen within people's homes, and that we shouldn't really criminalize those and have laws, criminal laws against those two things, prostitution and homosexuality. The report concluded that private acts, and they thought of these acts of prostitution as homosexuality as being private acts, and that they shouldn't be illegal, they shouldn't be criminalized, again, because the idea was that they're sort of private activities, and so therefore don't really harm the public, and so therefore shouldn't be criminalized. Now Devlin took the position sort of in disagreement with this report, and his legal perspective, again, he was an idealist, but to get more specific, those are very broad, idealist versus pragmatist. To get more specific, there's various legal philosophies that are discussed in this chapter. The first one we'll mention is Devlin's, which is legal moralism. And this is the view that morality should inform lawmaking, that morality has a close connection to law, that law should reflect our deeply held moral values. And this was Devlin's view, and so his was a legal moralistic point of view. According to Devlin, religion and morality were linked and must be the basis of law. So underneath law, according to Devlin, you have sort of an ethical foundation, a moral foundation, which traditionally in societies has come from religion. So you have this, according to him, you have this moral basis from which you derive laws. And so your laws should be consistent with the morality of your society. And that doesn't mean that everything that's right, everything that's morally wrong should be criminalized, but that there should be a connection there. And then we can get into more specifics here of how he viewed these issues. According to Devlin, if members of a society reached a consensus that certain behaviors are unacceptable, morally unacceptable, their collective judgment justified laws prohibiting the behavior. So Devlin said, how do we know if we should make something criminal? Well, if you can get people very widely throughout society to agree that this is bad behavior and should be criminalized, that if you have very wide public consensus, even if it's just simply a moral issue and a private morality, even if you're dealing with issues that people could say is really sort of a private thing. Well, if you have consensus in your society that it should be criminalized, and reasonable people across society agree with that, well, then it should be criminalized. Even private behavior could be criminalized if society was affected, and if you had consensus agreement by a wide percentage of people that this was something that people found unacceptable, and it should try to be stopped. It should try to be stopped with the law, and should have punishments attached to it since it was considered criminal. So So he's taking a legal moralistic point of view, which even private behavior is the sort of behavior that we might want to regulate, we might want to criminalize if society, if enough people believe that it's bad. Now, by contrast, let me introduce another philosopher to the picture here, so don't get confused by this, but I'm following the textbook here, just to inject this other idea. By contrast, John Stuart Mill, who was an English philosopher before Devlin and Hart, he argued that society should only concern itself with behaviors that directly harm others. And this became known as the harm principle. So Mill, his approach was that you don't want to criminalize anything more than you have to. You want to minimalize what you consider to be a crime, what you classify as a crime, and that it should be based on what real harm is done to members of society. So it may be something, if something is morally objectionable to some people, people don't like it, but there's really not too much harm, that you don't really have victims of the behavior, well, then John Stuart Mill would say, well, you should let that go. You should not criminalize that. Even if you don't like it, you should tolerate it, because society is healthier if we don't criminalize every little thing that people consider to be immoral, right? So his argument was only criminalize what you really have to because it's so harmful and so destructive. The obvious example would be something like murder, that you take somebody's life. Well, obviously that's unacceptable. The harm there is maximal. It's, that it's just about the worst harm you could do to another person, take their life. They're not going to get it back. So that's an obvious example. But this principle of harm is what Mill is pushing for. Mill was not concerned about behaviors that cause persons to hurt themselves or behaviors that might indirectly hurt others. So he would say, hey, we shouldn't have laws against suicide because it's your business how you behave. If you harm yourself, that's your business. That's what Mill would say. And he would say, and if it's a behavior that may in some indirect way hurt people, that shouldn't be criminalized either. So something like prostitution, where it's a business transaction between two individuals paying money for sex, Mills would argue that should be legal, that should be tolerated, even though there could be indirect victims, in the sense that maybe some man who's paying a woman for sex could end up doing harm to his family by causing his wife to want to divorce him, and it breaks up the family and it hurts the wife and the kids. That he would consider that to be sort of like an indirect harm, where you don't have a direct victim like you do with a robbery. Somebody sticks a gun in your face and takes your valuables. You have a direct victim there. He would say, well, you got to criminalize robbery, but not something like prostitution, where the people who are involved are engaged in that behavior voluntarily. So again, his argument is to minimize what we criminalize, right? So Mill argued that, and there's a word missing there, argued that promoting morality reduced individuality. So if you have a society that criminalizes and punishes everything, that it works against individuality. He was arguing for, hey, let people, let's have a society of maximum tolerance. Let people do what they want. If they do things that we don't like, well, that's fine. Let's let people live and let live. And variety is a good thing. People doing a lot of things that other people won't like, but they're being themselves. If they're doing things freely, then they're doing them because they want to do them, and that's a good thing if people are doing what they want to do, as long as other people aren't being hurt by it in some direct way, right? So again, this is an argument for minimal criminal law. By contrast, Devlin believed that regulating morality was necessary for a society to progress. According to him, morality was the bedrock of society, and society will collapse if you don't have a moral basis, if you don't have a moral order. And really, for those of you who've studied much sociology, I should say, This reminds me a lot of Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, who believed that society was a moral order. What keeps us cooperating with each other and working together peacefully and having a sort of harmonious, healthy society are things, our rules are a moral basis because it coordinates our behavior so we're all on the same page. And if we don't have that common morality, those common values and rules, then you get disorder, you get conflict, you get chaos, you get trouble. You could get societal weakness and collapse. So that's what Devlin is arguing here. Devlin felt that when societies collapse, it's more likely to do so through internal rot, or something like treason, or some weakness from the inside of society, as opposed to external force, and by that Devlin would mean, being conquered by some foreign armies. He would say more likely a society will become weak and collapse due to internal weakness. And of course, his focus here is on morals, so he would say it would become weak and collapse due to moral weakness, and people are not on the same page and don't agree about how everybody should behave. So he really believed that survival of a society depended on having this strong common moral foundation, and the law was sort of a reflection of that. Devlin did not make a big distinction between public and private morality. He would argue something like, well, prostitution is going to harm society because you're going to have it's going to hurt the family, right? You're going to have men going to prostitutes and then getting in trouble back home, and it's going to lead to divorce, and it's going to be kind of anti-family, and the idea is the family's foundation of society, and a family becomes weakened, then society becomes weakened. So he didn't think it was that useful to divide up the moral issues between the public and the private. Okay, Devlin defines immorality as those things which 12 random people would agree is unacceptable. It's like a jury. If you had a jury of 12 and all 12 people agreed, well, that's unacceptable, that's immoral, that's wrong, then that's something that Devlin would say, then maybe that's something that should be criminalized if everybody agrees that it's unacceptable. And that these people, along with their sort of sense that it's wrong, they'll tend to have feelings of indignation and disgust and feel the behavior should not be tolerated. So something like murder, something like rape, everybody agrees those are horrible, should not be tolerated, and we get upset and disgusted when we hear about those kind of crimes. So he would say those would be obvious examples of things that should not be tolerated, and we should have crimes and penalties to go against those behaviors. According to Devlin, laws should be carefully considered and not made in a hurry. Only significant issues should be addressed by law. So he's not that much different from Hart. We'll talk about Hart later. But he's saying that new laws should be passed slowly and with careful deliberation, because you undermine the credibility and authority of laws if you're passing laws quickly and then they turn out not to be good and people end up not liking them and rebelling against them or thinking that they were just foolish or something. If you do that, then it works against the seriousness and legitimacy of the law. People will come to not respect the law if you're coming up with hasty, rash laws, passing them quickly in the heat of the moment, which does happen. People, a lot of times, our legislatures tend to pass laws in reaction to really extreme events, very emotional events, and Devlin say that's not a good thing. You got to go slow and deliberate, or you're going to end up making some bad laws. Hasty laws could work to undermine the legitimacy of law. Okay, now, this Devlin and the Six Concepts, that he gets into some of these specifics here, but I'm getting long on this video, so let's take a break there, and part 2 I'll continue on.